Hi, my name is Kerry Osborne. I lead a group inside Google called the Database Black Belt Team. That's a team that focuses primarily on working with customers to solve hard problems in the database space. And I'm doing a talk called How to Improve Your Ability to Solve Complex Performance Problems. This is actually part two, as was a fairly long talk, and I did the first half of it last year's P99 conference. So there's a video out there on their site that I'll show you a link to here in just a second. And I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and skip through that one pretty quickly, but just to get the background information on some of the stuff that I'm talking about in this presentation. So I'll give you a real brief recap and to tell you sort of what we talked about, and hopefully you'll get a chance to go and see that one. First thing that we talked about in that one was the characteristics of a good problem solver. I spent a lot of my career interviewing a lot of people, a few thousand, and hiring a lot of those over the course of a couple of decades. And one of the things that I spent time doing was trying to figure out which ones of those were going to be good problem solvers, as that was really the main skill set we were looking for. We were in the consulting business, and a lot of what we did was performance work and on Oracle databases in particular. And so really understanding who had the gift to be able to solve really complex performance problems was part of what we were trying to figure out. So this presentation, part of it comes out of that. And so anyway, the first part of this presentation is focused on those characteristics that we look for and tried to weed out. Second part was the basics of how our brains work. As I followed a lot of these guys around and got to sit next to literally some of the best guys in the world at what they did, we started taking notes on how we did what we did and how the individuals that were really good at what they did, how they did that. And then started studying the literature. There's lots of information about the processes we go through when we're trying to solve a problem, the steps, the order that the steps go in, how much time is spent in each one of the steps, et cetera. So the second part of part one was to go through that basic literature and approaches. And we specifically dove into one in particular called recognition prime decision-making. That are used by is a method used by the FAA when training pilots and also the firefighters in the United States. It's one of the methods that they use, and it focuses on the ability to quickly identify some of the main suspects for the cause of the problem and to be able to quickly remediate it, because in both of those professions, time is of the essence. And so this particular method does provide a very rapid resolution most of the time for people who are very experienced in the field. And so that method corresponded closely to what we were doing in the performance tuning arena on databases. So that one matched pretty closely to what we were seeing in the field with the guys that were good at what they were doing. The third thing that we spent some time on in that first section was how those approaches lined up with what we were seeing in the field. And so there's some diving into that and some of the differences and similarities to the ones in the literature. So anyway, that's the basics of what was in that first presentation. Here's a link to get to it. Again, we encourage you to go out and have a listen to it real quick. It's not real quick, 30 minutes probably, and then come back and watch the rest of this one. It's probably dangerous to recommend that because I know I won't get everybody back, but hopefully most of you will see something of interest and come back and watch the second half. Okay, so who am I? Again, Kerry Osborne, longtime technical guy, primarily working in the Oracle database space, but the last decade or so, we've worked on a lot of different databases, many in the analytics space, and as well as in the transactional space, and have done a lot of migrations between many of those platforms. And again, spent a lot of time in the performance space in those databases. I did start as a developer and go through an up and down career, spending years being very focused in business aspects, years being very focused and very deep technically on performance space and other technical areas, and was also an entrepreneur. I was founder of 3 different companies, all of which had exits. The most recent one was acquired, or the IP was acquired by Google, and that's how we wound up here. So the whole team has similar backgrounds in that we're all spent most of our careers in the database world, and many of us doing performance work. So anyway, that's me. That's sort of the official bio. The real me maybe is a little bit different. I do have a creative side, and in addition to being extremely analytical, I did get a math degree and a geology degree back in the day. But the creative side is fairly strong in me as well. I did get paid to be a musician for quite a while, number of years, and I've been a speaker, a writer, a photographer, so lots of different areas that most people would probably consider to be creative. I am pragmatic, so I'm not a perfectionist. I don't believe that I have to have the perfect solution to a problem. I'm quite happy to trade off risk and expense and time against a perfect solution in order to get something that solves a problem quickly and gets a customer out of pain as quickly as we can. So again, not a perfectionist or dogmatic about how we have to go about solving a problem. I'm willing to make some compromises. I'm also fairly optimistic in terms of I always believe that we can make things better, including the systems we're working on. And so tend to have a fairly optimistic outlook on life in general. I love working with people, as you might have guessed from the number of people I've interviewed and hired and worked with over the years. But I must admit that I also enjoy working on my own, and like to spend time in my own head sorting through things. So I, have a mix of attributes in that regard as well. I have been paid to solve, complex problems for a living for a fair share of my career. So that's probably important to mention as well. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how we solve problems. Again, based on the experience with all the hiring and interviewing of people, that's become something I'm super interested in. And it's really the origins of why this presentation came to be. Okay, so part 2, how can we get better? This is the part where we actually talk about what we can do to improve our odds when we're trying to solve a problem. And the first question that comes to mind is, can we even improve? And of course, I believe that the answer is yes. Hard work makes up for a lot of deficits. Talent is obviously a really important characteristic of people that we would look for in this space. High IQ, rapid decision making, good communications, all those things are important. But yes, it is something that we can focus on, spend time on. And this notion of spending 10,000 hours or it taking 10,000 hours really to become world class at anything, whether that's as an artist, as a musician, or as a technical practitioner, all those things take a lot of practice. And so those two things do go together. Finding a combination of really, really talented people that also have really good work ethics is not that common. But when we find it, that's a magic combination. But I want you to know that my belief is that the hard work is the more important piece of the puzzle, right? Talent's super important, but hard work, there's no substitute for hard work. So, All right, so the two things we'll talk about in this portion of the presentation are techniques, or you can think of them as tricks, to improve our odds. And the second part is we'll just hit very, very briefly the topic of negative personality traits or factors. They're also known as cognitive biases in the literature, and we're all susceptible to some. I say we all are. Everybody I've ever met has had some of them, and so it's good to know what your limitations are, as Clint Eastwood would say, because that way you can try to avoid them, or at least be aware of them when they start to kick in. Okay, so that's it. So what are the main approaches for improving our odds that we'll talk about in this presentation? First one is ways of opening up our brains. There's lots of different ways that our brains process information, lots of different regions in our brain that process different types of information, and being able to bring those resources to bear when we're trying to solve a problem actually gives us a lot better ability to solve those problems than focusing only in one mode of thought or only in one area of our brain. And so just like collaboration helps us have better ideas that we can implement as potential solutions, having different areas of our own brain working on a problem also gives us more potential solutions that we can pursue. So that's one of the areas that we'll talk about. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I'm sure you've all experienced the tip of the tongue phenomenon. That's what we call it in English anyway. It's when you can think of a word and you know what the word means, but you can't remember what the word is. Or a name, for example. You know, you met somebody, maybe it's somebody that you've known for a decade or more, but for some reason you can't recall the person's name, although you can recall some of the semantic information, like you may be able to recall other names that sound similar or even the first letter of the name. So you know it's in there. It's just a matter of connecting the person, the memory of the person, or the meaning of the word with the word itself. And so there are various sort of theories about why this occurs. One of the ones that I think, is highly likely is that our brains process and store the semantic component differently than they do the meaning component. And so those two things are disconnected, and we form connections between them, but sometimes those connections are not as strong as they should be. And so we lose that connection, or temporarily can't find the connection between them. Anyway, I think that's probably highly likely, because I can almost always eventually come up with the word, but it may take, a few minutes to do so. Another one is in the study of people who've had brain damage, music. There are clearly different parts of the brain that process different aspects of music, and they're stored differently. So, for example, rhythm and pitch. People that have had brain injuries have exhibited the ability to follow rhythm, for example, of a song, and keep up with the beat and be able to reproduce it. And on the other hand, not been able to follow the melody and the pitch and keep up with it. So it's clear that there are parts of the brain that are involved in those two things separately. And so just another example of how our brain processes information in different parts of the brain and also in different ways. Okay, a second thing that we'll talk about in a little bit of detail is the hormonal inhibitors that we have that keep us from doing as good a job as we can on problem solving. I'm sure you've heard of adrenaline and the fight or flight sort of syndrome, which our adrenal gland releases some hormones. Cortisol is one of them that really shuts down some of the higher level functioning in our brain. So this is something that we want to avoid. A lot of times when we're in a pressure-packed situation in our job, and when we're in the performance tuning world, a lot of time there is a lot of pressure, particularly if it's a online retail system or something where there's money on the line for the time where we're not experiencing optimal behavior of our system, that stress can cause us to have problems and physical problems that impede our abilities to do the best job. So one of the things we'll talk about is a couple of techniques to reduce that and why it behaves that way in the first place. The last thing is sort of a different topic than the first two, but one of the things I want to be sure to mention, and so I decided to put it on this slide, was the fact that how we define the problem in the first place has an extremely large impact on the potential solutions that we can come up with. So imagine if somebody calls you up and you're a database guy, or calls me up and says, "Hey, my database system is running slow, and I need to speed up the I/O because it does a lot of I/O, and if I can speed up the I/O, I'm pretty sure that my overall processing is going to go a lot better." And as a helpful guy that I am, hopefully, my tendency is to want to say, well, yeah, there's lots of ways we can do that, right? We can move some of the storage to solid state, maybe the most active storage. We can move it to solid state disks, or perhaps we can change the block size so that we're doing fewer IOs to get the same amount of data back from the storage system. There's a lot of things, technical things we can do to speed up the system from an IO standpoint. But the right answer probably is not that. The right answer is usually, why do you think you need to speed up the IO system? And to take a step back and to think about the definition of the problem, because the definition of the problem, if we define it as speeding up the IO system, that immediately eliminates a lot of potential solutions to whatever the real problem is, because the real problem is more likely something like, I've got a report that has to get out by Monday morning at 8 a.m. and we don't get the data to start it until middle of the night on Sunday night, and I'm exceeding my SLA at this point because I can't get the report done in time. And there's a lot of other dependencies. Maybe payroll has to go out on Mondays, and I have to get this report done before I can run payroll, right? So there's some business implications that are really what's driving the need for the system to go faster. And it really has nothing to do with the IO system at all. That's just one of the components that might have a bearing on, might be a potential solution for us. So anyway, defining the problem can really narrow down the potential solutions, and it's something we need to keep in mind at all times. So I'll mention that again as we go through. Okay, so with that, we'll move on to technique, or trick, if you want to call it that. Trick number one. Trick number one is to draw a picture. And this is not going to surprise any of you, but drawing a picture is one of the best ways to get into problem solving mode, right? And there's multiple reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is that it expands the number of areas in our brain that are involved in the problem solving process. And I'll mention a few of them. This picture, by the way, was drawn by a guy named Carl Rao, who's a former co-worker of mine and a friend that now works at the Oracle performance group called the Real World Performance Team. And this is a way that he likes to visualize things. It's not my favorite way, by the way. It's something called a mind map, which is a way of linking thoughts together in a sort of a messy diagram by my way of thinking. I prefer something that's more organized, like an outline format or something like that. But anyway, Carl drew me this picture when we were having a technical discussion about plan stability issues in Oracle. And as he's drawing this picture, there's several things that are happening, both in his brain and in my brain. In his brain, drawing the picture activates his visual cortex, right? Because he's drawing a picture and he's thinking about how to visualize it, right? It's not a just a instantaneous that it came out of his brain that way, right? He's thinking creatively about, how would I draw this, and what would be the center, and what pieces would I connect to that? So he's going into this this design part of his brain where he's applying some creative processes. He's also verbalizing. He's using his verbal vocal part of his brain, because he's having described to me what he's doing. He's also using a tactile sense, right? He's got a pen in his hand and he's drawing this thing. So he's bringing in a part of his brain that deals with tactile stuff as he's explaining that to me, right? So there's a number of pieces or a number of things that are going on in his brain. He's also having to describe what he's doing, as I said, which brings him into a storytelling mode, right? Which is another part of the brain where he's trying to construct a dialogue about how these things all hang together. So there's a number of things that are going on in his brain. In my brain, it's the same, right? I've got a visual picture now that I didn't have before, which activates my visual cortex. I'm listening to the auditory component, which, I'm not a strong auditory learner, but it still brings in a different thought pattern. And then also the storytelling, the analogies that he's using to describe what he's doing also, triggers a different part of my brain to get involved. So this one technique activates so many different parts of the brain, and that's why it's number one on the list. Okay, so number two, say it out loud. I mentioned this already. Carl was saying out loud, which does, activate the vocalization part of his brain. But there's value. You might think this is weird, but just saying something out loud, even if there's nobody else around, activates a different part of your brain. So, and you may have noticed that there are people around you that are very vocally oriented. There are verbal learners, for example. I'm very visual as a learner. If you gave me a list of 30 things on a piece of paper, I can, generally leave the paper at home and still go and not miss any of them. If you verbally told me 5 items, I probably, am going to be hard pressed to come back with the 5 items. My son, on the other hand, is totally a verbal learner and really struggled in school because, most things are geared toward visual learners, and he really struggled with that. So he would read them out loud to himself in order to, get the verbal component. And that's what comes into play here. Even if you say something out loud, there are things that get triggered in your brain that, are not necessarily triggered if you're just thinking in your head or you're, visualizing things. So it is a valid thing to do, just to say something out loud. And I have worked with people who do that on a regular basis. And I've always thought it, when I was younger, I thought it was a little strange, that some people basically had to say things out loud to really understand what they were thinking. But there are people that's the way their brain processes. So, but all of us have that inside us, even though it's not as pronounced with some of us as with others. So it is a way to get, a different part of your brain working on a problem. It's also good if you can talk to somebody else. And I'm sure most of you have experienced sitting at a computer, working on a problem for a while, struggling with it, and having somebody come up behind you, a buddy perhaps, and saying, "Hey, what are you working on?" And, you say, "Oh, well, let me tell you about what I'm doing." And, about a minute into it, all of a sudden the answer comes to you, and it's for two, multiple reasons really, but one of them is that it's opening up that verbal part of your brain that you have not been using as you've been sitting there silently typing on your computer. And this is happens all the time. It's probably happened to me. I couldn't even count the number of times it's happened to me. So I'm sure it happens to a lot of people all the time. But anyway, the reason is, we're involving other parts of our brain that behave in different ways than our analytic focus part of our brain, which is usually the mode that we're in when we're sitting and typing on things. Okay, at which point I'm going to flash back to part one to talk a little bit about the modes that our brain works in. Okay, there's two modes of thought that we spend most of our time in, right? And they're named, they have multiple names, so I'll just throw them all out there. One of them is called variously the intuitive mode. In some of the literature, it's called system one or automatic. And the intuitive was sort of the early name, and we've kind of gone away from the intuitive and analytic way of labeling them, because it does imply some goodness or badness, some methodology, right? That intuitive, is a more loosey-goosey way of your brain working, and analytical is more of a, really methodical, detailed way of thinking about things. And in some ways those are true, but it kind of gives you a connotation that one's good and one's bad, and that's not really the case. So we've kind of switched to more of a, let's label them something that really doesn't imply anything, like system 1 or system 2, or more often I will use something like automatic or effortful. And so those are sort of more reasonable descriptions for the methods that our brains work in. And I'll give you an example to kind of lead into the discussion. And I'll also make the note that our brains are naturally lazy, so they want to be in automatic mode most of the time. But if I throw up that equation 1 + 1, very simple, you don't have to think about that. Your brain solves that in automatic mode. You're not analyzing and saying, if I had 1 peanut over here and 1 peanut over there, and I gave both of them to somebody, they would have 2 peanuts. Your brain just says that's 2. I don't even have to think about that, right? So on the other hand, if I say, what's 19 times 35, this one's going to require a little more effort for most of us, right? Because most of us are going to have to do, multiplication to come up with that answer, unless we notice that 19 is really close to 20. So I could just fake it and say, I know 20 times 35 is 700. That's pretty easy, right? And that can be done in intuitive mode. And I can take it a step further and say, actually, I know that it's exactly 35 less than 700, because it's 135 less, so it's going to be 665, and I can almost do that in intuitive mode. Well, I can do that in intuitive mode. I don't really have to do the long math to figure it out. But this is a good example of the difference between analytic and intuitive. In true analytic mode, I would go, okay, 19 times 35 is 9, times 5 is 45, and I'm going to carry the 4, and then I'm going to do 1 times 5. You're going to go through the whole long multiplication process. So that's analytic mode, right? All right, so a few comments. The system 1 or intuition sort of mode is correct most of the time. Closely correlated with the fact that it's in charge most of the time. We don't spend our life in analytic mode the majority of our life. And even if we're in the computer world and we spend 8 hours a day working, we don't spend 8 hours a day in analytic mode. And even if we did, that would only be a third of our life, right? So it's clear that we spend most of our time not in this analytic focused number crunching kind of mode. And we get by just fine, right? We do pretty well. We do some pretty complex stuff. We can drive to work, which is a fairly complex task. We have to get in the car and, we have to map out the path. We have to avoid the traffic. We have to stop at the stoplights. We have to turn at the right places. We have to find a parking place when we get there, et cetera. We can do all that in automatic mode. In fact, most of the time when I go to work, I don't remember what I did between the time I put the key in the car and the time I, turn it off when I park. That whole space of time can be a complete blur, because I can be thinking about something else, or on a phone call, or doing something completely different with my brain, right? Unfortunately, I've already gotten to the next bullet, but this intuitive mode is subject to a lot of biases. And more unfortunately, because we're lazy, we do a lot of things that we don't realize. And so, that substitution thing that I did, those kinds of substitutions can easily be done without recognition. And this long acronym stands for what you see is all there is. That's another common laziness that our brain will apply quite happily. If we see a couple of symptoms of a problem, it's very easy for us to assume that that's all there is. There's nothing else important to know. So we have to, and some of us are more susceptible to some biases than we are to other ones. So hence the cognitive bias part of the end of this presentation. But anyway, the problem with them is that it's, with some of them, it's very, very difficult to turn our biases off. And I'll give you an example here. So if I ask you, which of these two lines that are on the screen now do you think is longer? 99% of you will say the one on the bottom is longer and the one on the top is shorter. If I show you some measurement lines, those vertical perpendicular lines, you can clearly see that those lines, the horizontal lines, are the same length, right? Now, the scary part about this is that if I take those measurement lines away again, your brain still tells you that the one on top is shorter and the one on bottom is longer, even though we know that that's not the case. So this is just a demonstration that we do have these kind of biases built into our brain in the intuitive mode. And in many cases, we have no control over them. And even if we know they're not true, it's still very difficult for us to force ourselves to believe. Okay. This is called the Muller-Lyer illusion, by the way. And there are lots of things like this that we can look up if you're interested. Okay. So that was a digression. And I wanted to hit that before we got into the next trick, just to make sure that, everybody was clear on that. So the next trick is to take a break. Why do I say that? Because we do have these two modes of thought. We do tend to focus in a lot on the analytic side, on the effortful side. And some of the problems that we need to solve are require that. If we're crunching a bunch of numbers to figure out, which system that we're benchmarking is working the best, then that requires a focused approach and analytics. And the more we focus, the better we're going to do at it. If, however, we have a problem that doesn't require that sort of thinking, but requires some insight, and we'll talk about what sorts of problems do require that kind of thinking in a little bit, then we need to be in this other mode. And it turns out that the intuitive side doesn't work nearly as well when we're focused on something. So, and what I mean by that is, another way to say it is the intuitive side works better when it's not distracted by our effortful side. So if we're very focused on crunching numbers, comparing benchmark results, stuff like that, we're very likely to not notice some other important factors that may be playing in to the problem. And I'll show you an example of that here in a second, but it's very easy for us to get focused on the details and not allow that intuitive side of our brain to play in. So again, it's another reason why trying to intentionally open up other areas of our brain is important. So although I didn't really mention that on the draw picture, that's another reason for doing that, because you want to open up those other parts of your brain, because if you're focused in and not using those other parts of your brain, sometimes you can be in that analytic mode and you ignore all the other factors. So, all right. So if we are focused, distracting ourselves can be a very valid technique to help open up the possibilities of using that intuitive side of our brain. And you guys have probably experienced this as well, that you've had a problem that, lasts maybe for multiple days. It's like a real stumper. And one day, when you're very relaxed, maybe in the shower, maybe just waking up, all of a sudden you have a flash of insight or genius. And it's like, oh, that's the answer to that problem. I wonder, why I'm thinking of that now. And part of that is that this intuitive part of your brain works, I like to describe it as it working in the background. And so one of the things that I've taught myself to do that I think is helpful, I don't know whether it really is or not, but I feel like it is that when I have a hard problem or somebody wants my opinion on something, A lot of times I'll say, hey, let me let that roll around in my head for an hour and, I'll get back to you on it. Or, let me think about it overnight and, let's have another discussion in the morning about it. And what I find is that it gives me a chance for this intuitive side to actually uh, work on it in the background. And I don't know all the mechanics of that. I'm not a neurologist, but I do know that I usually have a lot clearer thought after I've had a little bit of time to break. And it also doesn't have to be hours or, overnight. It can be a very short break that can make a significant difference. And even, as short as getting up and getting a cup of coffee. So I would highly recommend that you experiment with this a little bit. If you're stuck on a problem, get up and walk around the block, get up and, go get a cup of coffee. Getting a cup of coffee or walking around the block have a couple of sideline benefits that can happen as well. You might accidentally get involved in a conversation with somebody that walks by you, and says, hey, how you doing? And then you got to, activate your audio, part of your brain. And you've also got to activate your storytelling part of your brain to come up with something witty to say to make them laugh. So, different parts of your brain are going to get engaged, as well as the fact that the intuitive side of your brain is getting to be working on something in the background. So there's multiple ways that this can help. And again, it doesn't have to be a long break. There was a study done several years ago now, but where they gave a bunch of these images that are meant to represent words. And so I won't hold you in suspense. The top one is Noel. The second one is mind over matter. But they gave a large number of these to a set of participants and actually repeated this study several times. But what they found was that, most people didn't get all of them, all these things. They would, leave a number of them blank. They would have a certain time limit that they could do the test in. And then they would get a break and would be told that they're coming back to do another kind of a test after their break. And the break was pretty short, like 15 minutes. And what they found was that on average, after a 15-minute break, this large number of participants that they ran through the study averaged 6 or 7 additional of these questions that they could answer after the break than they could before, even though they had plenty of time to work on them before the break. And they weren't told that they were going to be given the same set of papers. So it's not like they were actively thinking about these things that they had seen and trying to come up with solutions. This was just something that was going on in the back of their heads unconsciously, right? They're not even thinking about it. So anyway, good indication that even a short, go get a coffee, go to the bathroom, walk around the block, can make a significant difference and open up additional thought patterns. Okay. So what's that mean? Well, it means 2 things. One is taking a break's good, but relaxing is also important. So why is that? Let's dig a little more into the stress-related thing that I mentioned earlier on the hormones. Stress is a killer, right? It's like the stories of poor performance under stress are, they're a dime a dozen. They're all over the place. There are physiological effects that happen when we get under stress. Adrenaline, our adrenal glands secrete some hormones. Cortisol is probably the most famous. Well, adrenaline probably is the most famous, but cortisol is another one that they've done lots of studies on. And again, these shut down higher functions in the brain and are detrimental to our ability to solve problems, in addition to a lot of other things. And so, one example of that is people choking in sports events. And Shaq's a classic example, right? Back when he was playing basketball, he was notorious for being a very bad free throw shooter, which is supposed to be one of the easiest things you can do in the game, right? It's a 10-foot shot with nobody guarding you. You get as much time as you want, and you get to line it up and do your thing. And by the time, a guy's in the pros, he's shot literally, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of shots, right? And many of those have been free throws. So he's done this time and time and time again. And so should become an automatic mode thing, right? His brain should not be thinking about, how do I hold my hand and how do I, get the proper release where, the fingertips are on the back of the ball, et cetera. It should be a muscle memory thing where I'm just doing the same thing I've done, 50,000 times in my life before. Unfortunately, because he had so much stress, personally induced stress on him from shooting free throws, that his brain would not run in interactive or in this automatic mode, right? His brain would actually go into the effortful mode, and he would actually be thinking about the mechanics of how I hold my hand right and how I roll the ball off my fingertips. And so basically he's taking himself back to when he was a 6-year-old trying to learn how to shoot a basketball, because he's no longer in the intuitive mode where he doesn't think about it. His brain just knows how to do it automatically and is much more effective at it than he is when he's trying to think about the proper mechanics to do it. So, and there's been lots of studies about, how that works in multiple sports. Bribing is another thing. I'm not going to talk about this one too much, but there was another study done where they gave an intuitive type problem to solve that did require some intuitive thought. It wasn't an analytic sort of a problem. And they found that when they put additional stress on them, one way was by bribing them to say, the faster you solve the problem, the more money you're going to get. The more they bribed them, the worse people did at the problem, which seems counterintuitive, but basically the more stress they put on, the more hormones are going and the less well our brains work. So just another indication that the intuitive mode works when it's not stressed better than when it is stressed. And so that was one way. Reducing the amount of time that they gave them also put additional stress on them and also resulted in less success, as you would expect. But the bribing one was a little bit of a surprise to me anyway. Okay, so moving on. How do we avoid that stress? There are a few ways, but one of the ways that has been effective for me is to think about what's the worst thing that can happen to me when I've got a problem to solve that I'm not able to solve, right? And because that's what causes the fear, right? The fear is I'm not going to be able to solve this problem, and therefore the business is going to suffer, or who knows what's going to happen. It's really fear of it's the fear itself that's the problem, not really what's going to happen to you. Because for most of us are not in jobs where lives are on the line, right? We're in jobs where we're supporting computer systems that do accounting, or they do whatever they do, right? Scientific research or whatever. But they're not. People's lives are not at stake. So the worst thing that can happen typically is that we get yelled at. Our boss is not happy with us. The business suffers somewhat because it's taken longer to get their reports out. So, salaries are paid late or whatever. But it's not something that is going to, really cause anybody, health issues. And so if you can convince yourself of that, some of the stress can go away, right? And that's one way to do it. We had a guy that we worked with. He used to say, "Hope they ask me something I know." As a consultant, you always want to have the answers. So, but this was just put more stress on him than he needed. It was all, personal applied stress. Another thought that maybe can help is that any problem that I'm asked to solve is actually building muscle, right? It's that this idea that anything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? Is a pretty powerful thought. So if you can change your thought pattern to, what if I don't solve this? What if this goes bad? To, think about all the things I'm going to learn based on this project I'm working on, that can also reduce the stress. And the last thing I'll say, and this one is the key is the preparation. The more prepared we are, the less stress we're going to have. Right. So if you know your area very, very well, and you're knowledgeable on all the fundamentals around it. So you know something about hardware, and you know something about networks, and you know something about storage, and you know something about memory management, and you know something about the database layer, and you know something about the app tier. You know, you don't have to be an expert in all those things, but knowing how those things fit together and having a good grasp of that, along with your expertise in, you know, if it's performance tuning, if your expertise in the performance tuning area prepares you to be really good at what you do. And having that preparation behind you should give you a lot of confidence that you're going to be able to solve a lot of the problems that are thrown at you. And again, how does preparation happen? It comes from a lot of practice, right? So, you know, this idea of 10,000 hours to really become world class at anything is valid. It's something that, you know, that really holds validity. And so we have to put in the hours, we have to put in the time, and we're going to get better and better at it over time as we practice. So, okay, a quick digression. Another way to reduce stress that, you know, I've added to this deck recently is music. And that may be surprising to you, but there was a study that I read recently that compared using Valium in a pre-op situation when you're going in to, you know, have surgery to music as a way to reduce the stress going in. So it's very common for patients to be given Valium as a drug-induced way to reduce the stress that people have coming into a surgery. And so in this study, they actually had people listen to music, you know, on headphones as a replacement for Valium, and they studied the results. And you may be surprised to know that music won. So listening to music is actually a valuable way to reduce stress. However, it only works if you get to pick the music. When they tried it with randomly selected music, it didn't beat the Valium. So the Valium was more effective than randomly selected music. But if you select music that you like or enjoy, then the music won out. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I want to give you another bonus that's for free, and that's that humming is music too. So you don't have to have headphones on. You can just hum a little ditty while you're working, and that can also have a stress reducing effect on your brain. And I'll mention this too, that the reason I mention this is because my spouse fairly recently, in the last month or two, told me that she read an article that said that humming was a coping mechanism for people that were experiencing high levels of stress. And she asked me what I thought about that. And I said, well, I don't know. And she said, do you know that you hum an awful lot? You know, like most of the time you're humming. And I'm like, well, no, I never really noticed that I'm humming a lot. But she said, you hum all the time. So I don't know if it's a result of being in a stressful job or if it's a coping mechanism that I use to reduce stress. And that's one of the reasons why I tend to be fairly relaxed and don't feel stress a lot. But anyway, I found it to be interesting, so I thought I would share. Okay, on to trick number 4, collaboration. 2 heads are better than one. I think, you know, particularly if the 2 heads are somewhat diverse. So the more diversity we've got in a group for collaborating on a problem, the more opportunities we have for unique ideas, and therefore the more opportunities we have for viable solutions. I'll also mention that I don't think it is necessary that everybody that's collaborating on a project needs to be an expert. It's great if they're experts in different areas. That can bring a lot to the table. But even people that don't have, that are in the same area but have differing levels of experience can bring a lot to the table. As long as we allow them to participate, right? What we don't want is the less experienced people to not have a voice, not be able to express their opinions, because this difference in viewpoint, much like using different parts of our brain, gives us opportunities for more creative solutions and more potential solutions than what we would have without it. And, this may feel a little controversial to you, but my experience has been that the more diversity we can have in a collaboration group, the more diverse the potential solutions can be, and therefore the more opportunities we have for success. So there's another reason, and that's because it requires us to communicate. So again, going back to trick number one, the more we have to sketch on the board, the more we have to verbalize, the more we have to visualize, the more we have to do storytelling, the more we have to say things out loud. All these things also contribute to the ability to have different parts of our brains working on the problem. So there's some built-in advantage to that as well. Okay. Trick number 5, ignore the question. I mentioned that on the very first slide. The problem definition is super important. Einstein is attributed with a quote where somebody asked him if he had to save the world in an hour, what would he do? And he said something to the effect, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes working on solving it, right? And I do think that that's not too far from the truth. The way we define the problem is super, super important. I've already stressed it enough, but ignoring the question can often lead to fundamentally different outcomes, right? If we ignore the way the question is phrased and go back and rephrase the problem, redefine the problem, a lot of times we have multiple things that we can do. So anyway, this one is not to be ignored. And that's why it's trick number 5. Trick number 6, ignore the conventional wisdom. This one is a bit of a long shot, but if we're following the path of conventional wisdom, there's a lot of biases that creep in. There's dogma that can take over. We eliminate a lot of valid choices without even being aware of it, because a lot of times we're not aware of our biases to begin with. And so, there's a lot of things that we miss. And so when we're really stuck on a problem, sometimes getting in a brainstorming session where you just, try to do exactly the opposite of what you expect. And one example of that I'll throw out, there's a product that Oracle came out with called an Exadata, which is a combination of hardware and a database. And the whole premise, one of the main premises of Exadata was that it had a distributed storage, smart storage layer built into it. And one of their premises was that we could push the work to where the data lived. And so for many, many years in the database space, one of the main tuning techniques we had was to try to get as much as we could in memory and to try to access data via indexes, which were much smaller than the data themselves, which meant we could get the indexes in memory, which meant we could get very rapid access to a lot of the data. And so when Exadata came out, we had this new super efficient distributed low-cost storage platform with CPUs built into the storage so they could actually do processing. So we had this new paradigm shift, and we were able to do full scan processing in many cases faster than we could do index access out of memory. So all of a sudden we had this new paradigm because they were doing exactly the opposite of what the conventional wisdom was in order to speed up database processing. So it is, a bit of a long shot, I'll admit that, but it is a viable technique that, can open up some completely new vistas for ways to solve problems in creative ways. So I'll just throw it out as an idea to, keep in the back of your head if you get stuck. All right. That's it for the, the options for opening up your brain. I'll mention a couple of personal blind spots that I'm susceptible to and encourage you to go and look at cognitive biases as a topic and try to learn which you're most susceptible to and then learn how to avoid them. Okay. So they can keep us from being effective. They are ingrained. They are very common and they're pretty easy to spot. Uh, and the key is to identify your own personal ones. So one that I'm susceptible to is I got a hammer and everything looks like a nail. So I have to constantly be reminding myself to not use something that I'm really good at to try to solve the problem when it's not really the cause of the problem. Millsap, one of my mentors, says it this way. He says, it doesn't help to look in the flower pot for your keys when you lose them in the sewer, right? Just because you like the smell of the flower and you don't like the smell of the sewer doesn't mean that you should, look in the flower pot for your keys. It's kind of a creative way of saying, go where the data takes you, not what you enjoy researching or what you're good at, the kind of problem that you're good at solving. Okay. Second one, not being able to see the forest for the trees. This one is one that a lot of us are susceptible to, right? When we're really focused on something, it's hard to notice some things that should be glaring, which we might not miss if we were a little more open-minded and a little less focused on what we're staring at. So there was a study, many years ago now, where they had a bunch of subjects look at a basketball video section of about 10 minutes or something. And the participants were told to make a mark every time the ball was passed from one player to another and to ignore everything else. Just make sure you can count all the passes and try not to miss any. It's, it's very important that we get the right number at the end of the video. And so the participants watched it. And at the end of the 10 minutes, the moderator came in and asked them to also mark down on their sheet of paper if they saw anything unusual in the video. And so when the results were tallied after, I don't know how many hundreds of people they ran through this study, lots of people, but the results were that almost none of them noticed anything unusual in the video. They all, had dutifully written down the numbers, but a few of them noticed that during the middle of the game, there was a guy dressed in a gorilla costume that came out into mid-court and waved his hands and, and then went off the court. And so only a very small percentage of the people noticed that because they were very focused on counting the number of passes. So that's a pretty eye-opening, example of how this being able to miss the forest for the trees sort of phenomenon can happen. And this is another one that, I think all of us are susceptible to, but it's definitely one that, I have to remind myself not to fall into that trap. So, okay, the last one is Houdini. Houdini, was famous for breaking out of all kinds of, constraints, including jails. And so he went on a tour at one point where he was went from town to town to town and let them lock him up in their jails, and then would break out in a matter of a few minutes. And so, except for one, he went to one town. They put him in a jail, and he was in there for an hour and finally gave up. Said, "I can't figure out how to get this lock open." And so as he was saying that, the story was that he leaned against the door and the door swung open. And so the moral of the story was that he was so focused on getting the lock unlocked, which it already was, because he assumed that it was locked, that he hadn't even, thought about the possibility that the lock wasn't locked. So it was an assumption on his part that, the lock was locked. And so that kept him from being successful in solving that problem. And so this is just another, warning to all of us to make sure we're very careful about what assumptions we're applying to the solutions that we're coming up with. And again, a lot of times it's hard to know them, because a lot of times they come from biases that, we don't recognize readily. So again, another reason to, kind of do a little research on your own cognitive biases and see if you can set yourself up to try to not fall into that pitfall whenever you can. avoid it. And I think that's about it for this presentation. Wrap up. Yeah. The problem-solving process is part science and part art. I do strongly believe that we can improve on our natural abilities by being aware of the process, the mental process that we go through. Refer back to part 1 for more detail on that. By opening up the different pathways in our brain, as many as we possibly can. I'm sure you guys can come up with some other ways that I didn't mention, by the way. By being aware of our own biases and trying to avoid falling into those traps, and by developing the right kind of attitudes about who we work with, how we work with them, how we work, how we collaborate, etc. Being optimistic, reducing our stress levels, all those things, can improve our chances. And also by watching others, observe the people around you who do a good job at it, and try to take note of what they do and how they do it, and see if you can mimic some of those behaviors. And don't forget to practice. Practicing is very, very important. The more practice you get, the better you're going to get at it. And of course, by remaining curious about how things work, so that your innate knowledge, your knowledge of the systems increases. And finally, of course, by humming. And with that, I'll close.